Welcome everyone. My name is Björn Krondorfer. I'm the director of the Martin Springer Institute here at Northern Arizona University. I welcome everyone to the third conversation on our conversation series on race, rights, and resilience, 4 perspectives by Jewish and Black women. I, of course, will introduce our speaker tonight momentarily, but I want just to say a few things about the series and about the Zoom etiquette and what to expect for today. And then we get started in serious ways. Let me start with the Zoom etiquette and what to expect today. Please leave your microphones muted while Stephanie Mitchem is talking. The last 25 to 30 minutes, we open it up to conversation with our guest speaker for Q&A, short comments, remarks. Of course, at that point, we'd like you to unmute, ask a question. If you ask a question, we would love it if you could also show us, put the video on that we can see who we are talking to. And that is pretty much all there is. We all get so used to the Zoom etiquette that it shouldn't be too much of a problem. Of course, we hope that there are no technical glitches. And so far, we were extremely lucky. I want to also introduce Melissa Cohen. She's a program coordinator here at the Martin Springer Institute. She and I are co-hosting this session. So if we have maybe a technical difficulty, you might send her an email. She might be able to check and help you, and maybe not, depending on what the situation is. Today, it's the third part of our series on race, rights, resilience. We already had Kate Tomini speak to us on the comparative landscape of the Holocaust and American slavery, followed by Susanna Heschel on Jewish prophecy and civil rights. Her introduction to her father's work, Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was a civil rights leader working with Martin Luther King, but also her own take on the current situation on race and anti-Semitism, informed by both a feminist and colonial perspectives. And today we have our third series on race, human rights, and spiritual resilience with Stephanie Mitchem, whom I introduce in a moment. And we end that series on a Sunday, December 6th. It has to be a Sunday because that person, Susan Neyman, will call in from Berlin, Germany. And given the time difference, it had to be on a morning. And for her, it had to be on a weekend. So it's on a Sunday morning, 11 o'clock. And I hope we will see you for that one as well. Stephanie, thank you so much for being with us today. It is truly a pleasure to have you with us and to listen to your talk for about 35, 40 minutes before we then switch to the Q&A. Stephanie Mitchem, she is a professor in the Department of Religious Studies and also in the Women and Gender Studies program at the University of South Carolina. She really has a strong sensibility and commitment to teaching and learning. She sees teaching and learning as both a revolutionary and evolutionary act, and she engages her students in what she calls the radical art of thinking. I really like that phrase. She is teaching in multiple fields that include theology, ethics, history, anthropology, and ethnography to engage various topics that really reach from the exploration of African-American lives as well as African lives in the diaspora. She has a number of books. I will perhaps mention 1 or 2 of them. One is called Introducing Womanist Theology. If you're not quite sure what that is, you might want to ask her afterwards. Another book is on African-American folk healing. And the third book I want to mention is on race, religion, and politics. It is subtitled Towards Human Rights in the United States. So just by reading you the title of her books, you might understand why I invited Stephanie to this talk and why I'm really happy that we have her here today. On a personal note, I may want to add something that Stephanie shared with me last week, that she is so courageous to go on an airplane next week and fly to Nigeria to do her fieldwork in Nigeria. And it's courageous because anyone traveling during the pandemic crisis, I think, is courageous, but also because it comes with complications. COVID-19 testing before she leaves, COVID testing when she arrives in Nigeria, because the Nigerians are not fully trusting Americans for good reasons, I think, at this point, when it comes to COVID-19. But anyway, and if there's time left, Stephanie, maybe you may even want to say just a few words about what your plans are to do in Nigeria. So without further ado, Stephanie, the forum is yours, the Zoom is yours, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I am so honored to be invited to this talk. I am so happy to be participating in this series. I'm sorry that I have not been able to attend all of the things, as I've been juggling all the things to get ready to go. Okay, so I'm not going to go into this much, but basically, I kept putting it off because I kept waiting for the airlines to say the flight's canceled, for the country to say it's closed on either side. And so I just ended up packing about a month ago. So I've been a little nuts on that. But let me tell you about race, human rights, and spiritual resistance. And part of this is going to end up getting to even why I end up going back and forth to Nigeria and to Africa. But let me focus here first. This is actually my third version of this talk. And the third version is absolutely influenced by the 2020 election results. But first, let me tell you about versions 1 and 2, only because parts of them will bubble up in other places, even as it is happening. So at first, when I thought about race, human rights, and spiritual resistance, I thought I could focus on the concept of hubris with an intentional look at the current resident of the White House and his family. I mean, it's kind of like a Greek play waiting to happen. Hubris refers to extreme arrogance, excessive pride, and usually comes before a fall. I couldn't decide if I should focus from like Sophocles or Shakespeare. And yes, before you ask, I did begin as a theater major, okay? My second focus was on the many of this talk, was on the many protests, left or right, and the connections to religious thought, wondering if perhaps there's a thread there of spiritual resistance. I personally have walked many picket lines and attended various protests, but there are sharp changes today in the obvious incorporation of religion. For example, Paula White, hired as a White House aide, but viewed as the president's personal pastor, has screeched about demon babies. If you don't know Paula White, you will certainly have a good time watching her perform her idea of religion. The KKK regenerated with its belief in Christian centeredness. Meanwhile, both the left had both religious and human rights themes on which I could have focused. For example, Bishop William Barber and the New Poor People's campaigns, or statements from the Episcopal Church and the Pope, Reverend Jim Wallace's various books. And there were ethical and humanist components, the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement, the fights to end systemic racism, and often led by families and mothers of Black people who have suffered state-sanctioned police violence, the calls on many levels to end gun violence, often led by young people, and the many ways that climate change and especially climate inactions are being challenged, again, with young people in the lead. I am so honored quite often to teach my students because they're the ones who are at, I just tell them up front, you're the ones who will change the world. It's on you, which I hope makes them feel a lot of guilt and anxiety, and then they'll do it. But then the election results finally came in, and my focus shifted this third time to the current version. And it was Kamala Harris that tied these things together for me. She stated in her acceptance speech, I am thinking about her mother, her mother, and about the generations of women, Black women, Asian, white, Latina, Native American women who throughout our nation's history have paved the way for this moment tonight, women who fought and sacrificed so much for equality, liberty, and justice for all. And she acknowledged, Harris acknowledged, all the women who have worked to secure and protect the right to vote for over a century. She stated, tonight I reflect on their struggle, their determination, and the strength of their vision to see what can be unburdened by what has been, and I stand on their shoulders. That was the moment that tied all of this together for me: race, rights, and spiritual resistance. The result is that this talk is now more reflective, although I do draw from some books I've written, because all those things are in my head all the time anyway. But I needed to find stories to finish the talk. So I have at least 2 stories, probably more built in, and I may end up reflecting on my stories at some point. First though, just so we're on the same page, I'd like to clarify some of the terms I'm using. The first one is racism. Racism, I mean, it really is obvious that it's connected to this. Racism is a system that in the United States revolves around white power racial constructions. Even when it seems that a town or area is heavily populated by another race, when the broadest socio-political structures are taken into account, power can be arrayed against people of color. I am from the city of Detroit. When I moved to South Carolina, some white people here used to hold up Detroit as proof that Black people can be racist too. There were some really, like, there was a mayor of Detroit, Coleman Young, who told all the white people to get out. I mean, it was, you know, this was held up as racist. But this Detroit was not an idealized Black island. The state of Michigan eventually found a way to break that power and determined that Detroit and other Black-led cities in the state were too fiscally irresponsible to care for themselves. And the state of Michigan took the cities and broke them with state-appointed caretakers who ignored the duly elected city governments. One of the ones that you may have heard about is Flint, Michigan, where people are still suffering with the kinds of waters, the poisoned waters, that were the result of the choice of the appointed caretaker. So Black citizens in this process were disenfranchised. That is only one example of the systematized system of racism. I know, that doesn't, systematized system, okay, but I couldn't resist that. The most insidious thing about racism is that race itself is on one level a non-reality. Seriously, it has no biological import, or little, I mean really little things like who gets sickle cell anemia and who gets aplastic anemia. But either way, it has nothing to do with our being human. The creation of the concept of race actually began with European colonial expansion in its current form, and it was only entered into the Oxford Dictionary in the 1700s. Think about that. We spend a great deal of time talking and thinking about racial differences. How much power do we give this concept of race? Some of the things we call racial differences may really reflect cultural or socioeconomic differences. Either way, none of it makes a difference in the distinction of our humanity. The next term I want to clarify is spirituality, and I also want to clarify spiritual resistance. One leads to the other. So I'm going to start with spirituality first. I define spirituality as a way of being in the world. It does not have to be a way of religion. This is important. It can be a way of power. It can be a way of wealth. We see many people sitting in churches or synagogues or temples, and we know that they are not living what they profess. We know that. Instead of calling them out as hypocrites, maybe we need to stop and really identify what compromises their real spirituality. Spirituality is a total way of being in the world. So, for example, I talked about people who sit in the church pews. When I first came to Columbia, South Carolina, I was instructed gently to become a member of a particular church. I don't even want to identify, because that's where all the power brokers went. And I would be in with the power brokers. So spirituality in this sense is not only those components bounded by a certain denomination or religion. Rather, understood in this broader way, spirituality can incorporate structures of organized religion as well as go outside those bounds. This definition locates a person where they live in relationship within given communities. Most importantly, spirituality in this sense gives room to explore the existent framework of faith beliefs. So if Christianity says these following things, are people living up to those faith beliefs? I've seen some really horrible things as the questions of healthcare and the Affordable Care Act have come forward. Some man was sitting and talking about if they took away his health care, that if they didn't give him that he would be unable to have health care, and he had a medical condition. And basically, one of the people listening to him, a man, said something to the effect of, "You need to get a job, buddy," and went over and kicked him. So, and I bet the man who kicked him proclaims himself to be an amazing Christian. So my wider view of spirituality challenges the Western inbreeding of what is too often defined as mainstream Christian spirituality that divorces body from mind, from spirit. Black and indigenous religious thought embraces the idea of an embodied spirituality. A different anthropology of religion is operating, informed by cultural views. Such embodied spirituality is holistic and part of the lives of communities, such as Vice President-elect Harris, viewing herself as standing on the shoulders of women who came before her. When thinking about all the hidden voices of Black and Native and Latina women, all the broken places, there has to be a resilience that aims toward human rights. Spiritual resilience involves the engagement of a form of cultural creativity to take control of our own lives and affirm our own humanity for all humans. In this case, that resilience is not the exclusive purview of Black Americans. There are multiple ways that power is created in order to manage situations in life. For African Americans, especially Black women, spiritual resistance takes more specific forms because power has been denied them on so many levels in American society. Black women and men redraw the boundaries of who the powerful are. They reframe discussions of power in ways that renegotiate their own roles in the world. So it's not merely a salve for the ego. Spiritual resistance becomes reality. It forms community, it raises families, it finds jobs, and it improves lives where they are. Power is tapped through resistant and defiant language. Power is tapped through multiple refusals to just quit. In this view, power becomes a spiritual quest. One last term, and then I can get to stories. Human rights refers to not privileges, not earned gratuities, but those things that each and every human should have in life. We often start with the basics, if you've ever seen that pyramid of needs. So we start with the idea of food and shelter, and then we begin to think about more complex issues like equality or equity or healthcare. I advocate for human rights from below within the United States. To do so brings human rights into our national consciousness as it applies to ourselves. We're not talking about human rights for those people in that country. We're talking about what is needed here. To be clear, human rights are not easy answer, but paths. To be clear again, human rights are neither liberal nor conservative in themselves. One of the people I met in Detroit who was an amazing, amazing activist was Grace Lee Boggs. And so I blame her for she's deceased now, so it's easy to blame her. I blame her for a lot of the ways my own thinking has been shaped, but this is something that she wrote in her last book. Just as we need to reinvent democracy, now is the time for us to reimagine work and reimagine life. The new paradigm we must establish is about creating systems that bring out the best in each of us instead of trying to harness the greed and selfishness of which we are capable. It is about a new balance of individual, family, community, work, and play that makes us better humans, close quote. In thinking of learning new ways of being human together in the United States, I believe that human rights are new and continued bases for American community building, yet I am aware this is difficult. A lot of people will run away screaming socialism or communism, and I have a basic belief that Americans would make awful, awful socialists and dreadful communists. Instead, there is a saying from Latinx cultures, cada cabeza es el mundo, that usually is translated to each his or her own. Instead, I'm drawing on the literal translation. Every head, each head or mind is a world. Each head or mind is a world, and that is the start of the complexity of human rights from below. Boaventure de Sousa Santos coined a phrase that furthers this idea of human rights from below, interculturality. What he finds most significant for community development are stories. The stories we tell each other that cross the boundaries that have been set up, they cross hardened barriers, interculturality. Further, he contends that crossing barriers can strengthen the legitimacy of both a worldwide and a place-based politics of human rights. And so now to the stories. This is a woman with whom I spoke 2 years ago. I interviewed her, She does a lot of work for social justice and is often a leader. One of the things that I know she has done, she was a community organizer following the unrest in Ferguson, Missouri. And she was part of a group that worked to find out what the community wanted from the police. They did an entire study to find out what the community wanted. The police department knew that they were going to do this. And they did. They did a lot of work. They built a study that said, here's what needs to be done to resolve issues between the community and the police. They turned it in to the police and the city council, and I guess it was filed somewhere. Nobody has ever done anything about it. The question I asked her was, how do you keep going? So this is her story. She said when she was 10, Rodney King was beaten. Amber lived in Los Angeles at the time. She said, I remember that moment when Rodney King said, can't we all just get along? And I remember that moment. She discusses a lot of other little moments. She said, these are all the little moments that create my frame. So what it means now, she thinks about, what does it mean to find joy in the middle of battle? What it means to be in community and to feel safe, what it means to emphasize difference, because healing can't be just for one group. It has to be for all of us, or that's not healing. So we all have to rise up together. It can't just be Black people or Hispanic people coming into power. We've been dismantling these systems for 100 years, more than 100 years, but not actively healing with and through them. So we keep repeating the same traumas over and over again. My work now centers explicitly on healing, justice, and equity, because we have to heal from the inequities before we can start creating new systems. Those are the moments. Amber's spiritual resistance led her to activism. And while there may not be a layer of religion over her search for social justice, there is clearly a depth and generosity for the wholeness of all people. Healing itself becomes a form of spiritual resistance from an African-American perspective. This healing connects the physical, emotional, and spiritual, the ancestors with the descendants, nature with humans, humans with each other, and with the divine. Rupturing any of these relationships is expressed in some form of sickness and is understood that way in many Black communities. It could be physical, but it could also be mental, emotional, or spiritual. For example, I overheard a young Black woman remark on the long lingering death of an elderly white man. And she said, he died that way because he did so much wrong to other people. Although the man was elderly, the quality of his death still indicated his ruptured relationships to this young woman. Healing points to repaired and restored relationships, and hence another future. How am I on time? Am I good? You're muted. You're muted. Am I okay?
You're okay. You have at least 15 minutes or even 20 minutes.
I'm good. I'm good then.
You're good.
Okay. I'm good. Okay. Because I didn't time this out. Remember, this is my third iteration. Yeah. So I'm just pulling this together at the end. But I did pick out these two stories. So I want to tell another story, and that's of Ma'afa. I don't know how many of you have ever heard that word. And I really thought about it in terms of the Holocaust discussions that have been going on. There's a sense of play between past and the present with issues of unresolved pain. And so some of these are expressed in different ways. And so I witnessed a specific ritual on July 3rd, 2004 in New Orleans. It was before Katrina. That's why I mentioned the date, 2004. It was the Ashe Cultural Center, Cultural Arts Center. And it was involved with a variety of other local organizations to hold the Ma'afa, which is, Ma'afa is a Kiswahili word that means great disaster and is being used to describe the Atlantic slave trade. The term intends to capture the magnitude and impact of the slave trade as slavery was transformed by Western Europe and America. Ma'afa events also educate the public about the nature of enslavement and the transatlantic slave trade. Ma'afa events, some are held in the United States, but they're also held at different locations through the world, especially those linked by the Middle Passage. In the ceremony that I attended, several New Orleans organizations were involved that cut across any religious or political lines, assembling people with various interests. Some of the participating groups included the Men of Nehemiah, I'm not sure in what sense that is, the Institute of Black Catholic Studies, the Audubon Institute, the Congo Square Foundation, Liberation Zone Ministries, the Nation of Islam, the People's Institute for Survival, and the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Foundation. So it wasn't strictly religious. Obviously, all kinds of people came together. And under the Cultural Center's leadership, these organizations pooled resources to come together around the 4th of July to create an alternative celebration and ritual that honors the sacrifices of African-American ancestors. I have not looked to see if they still do this. Remember, this is before Katrina. The date of the annual event was deliberately chosen. One participating organization handed out copies of a Frederick Douglass speech that challenged the meaning of the 4th of July to the slave. There are many who would question what kind of freedom Black Americans today celebrate, and some of those discussions occurred at that gathering. The remembrance began at 6 a.m. in Congo Square with a ceremony. An altar had been erected using traditional African symbols. Participants were invited to wear white clothing to the event, white being a color used in traditional African religious ceremonies, signifying protection for the wearer. The ceremony began in Congo Square because it is the historic site of a major slave market. That ceremony included prayers and speeches from different perspectives. Everybody had some prayers to say there. Following this opening ceremony, drummers and dancers led the way through a door of no return that had been erected in the square. The reference to this door of no return deliberately parallels the name given to doors, locations on compounds at ports, and I've seen some of these, on the African continent that held captives for deportation to various colonies. At the major transportation ports, the exit from the holding chamber as captured Africans were herded into ships has been called the door of no return. All participants in New Orleans followed the drummers in procession through the streets. We went through the heat of the morning, it was hot, to a Mississippi River park. There, following prayer by another member, as well as some poetry and music, we processed to the river where we threw white flowers on the waters in memory of African ancestors who died in the Atlantic, as well as those who had been brought in as slaves. These two stories tell the story, the broader story of race, rights, and spiritual resistance. In a lot of ways, we could say that they make no sense. Why would Amber, one person, feel the need to work for rights based on what happened with within, see, I'm already putting her in Ferguson, that happened to Rodney King. But we've seen some of that same kind of thing happen with the development of Black Lives Matter. That began from the same kind of protest and process against murder of Black people. And again, Black women were at the front of putting that together. I've read some of their work. I actually have Patrice Culler's new work about what the meaning of power is on my Kindle to read on the plane ride. But just the idea that instead of being pressed down when these things happen, that they become an opportunity where people rise up to reach for their rights, and resisting what racism is trying to do. I want to go back to the concept of hubris real quickly. I think part of what is going on in the US today is not just, I was going to point a finger at the current resident of the White House. It's also the American people who have suffered from a kind of a hubris. Just people who have been so in love with patriarchy and hierarchy, and a belief that the free market can free us. And so there's an arrogance in that. I've read of some things where people in other countries talk about the United States is now broken of its moral imperialism. So instead of us saying, oh no, we can't send you any money if you're going to hand out birth control to those women, now all of a sudden we can't even get ourselves together as we are going forward trying to battle a pandemic. We have, I think it's the third highest, it might be even higher than that, number of deaths. We have one of the, this is hubris for us, I think, as well. And we have learned again that ignorance of the government's operations doesn't excuse our participation in government. So that's another form of seeking human rights with which we've become more aware. I remember the responses many people had to seeing pictures of babies in cages. All of a sudden, this didn't feel like what we always thought of as the United States. So that's part of what I wanted to say today, to think about all the protests over the years and to realize that women have often borne the burdens while they show and live into resiliency. Through it all, spirituality runs, a way of being in the world. If we think about it, all the things that have been done, people should have just been crushed. There's something else there. So I close with that. And I didn't get to as much of my own story as I wanted to. So.
We can always get to this, Stephanie. Thank you so much. I think I'd like to follow up with one question and then we open it up to other people on our call. And I want to return to the way how you looked at spirituality and then at justice eventually. And it sounds like spirituality for you is a particular way of being, a way of being that it seems to me cannot be self-centered, but must be other-centered. It has to be centered on the community, on other values than your own value. It seems to me spirituality, you didn't say this, but I'm saying this, that spirituality also transcends time. It's not just our time, it's a time before us and that of people who came before us and the time after us. you know, we need to take care of, so to speak, of the legacies and our ancestors, as we have to take care of the people who come after us, our children or adopted children or spiritual children, however you want to call it. I'm coming to my question. That is, the American culture seems to be focused much more on the present and be forward looking, and not much backward looking. And that comes with certain advantages, but it comes with a disadvantage that we disregard the pain and the traumas of the past. How do you see the role of spirituality for us to figure out what to do with these unresolved legacies in this country?
So I'm going to go back to your first statement about being other-centered. Before people can be other-centered, they have to know who they are. One of the things I heard over and over again from the African-American women I interviewed is that they couldn't grow until they gave up the idea that they had to take care of everybody. And that has been a limit, I think, to a lot of women, especially to women of color, the belief that we have to take care of everybody else's needs before our own, or we are considered selfish, angry. I mean, all those kinds of words are layered on us. How do we get past that? That in itself becomes a spirituality step. In knowing who we are, that also demands that we understand the past. There is an African symbol, an Adinkra symbol, which is Sankofa. And Sankofa is shaped like a goose, a bird with a long neck looking over its shoulder. And the symbol of Sankofa is something to the effect of look back to go forward. And so that is a kind of a reflection that I'll find will run throughout Black communities, at least. The desire to avoid looking backwards quite often is from the perspective of white Americans. So I'll give you an example, a real clear example. I taught a class that was one of those 200 level undergrad classes I will never teach again, but 200 level incoming students classes. And I'm here in South Carolina, history of enslavement. And so one of the things I was trying to get students to think about is complicity, the concept of complicity. And I was saying, so if you get blue jeans from place X, Y, and Z, they have used dyes that are killing people in Central American countries where the runoff from the dyes are running into the rivers, into the drinking water. You know, you teach sometimes and you realize it's just totally gone over students' heads. It was like blanks. Everybody's sitting there in blue jeans and nobody wants to think about being complicit with the kinds of blue jeans they have on. Then I asked the question, I said, okay. Here's another example, reparations. Reparations for those, what do you think about the concept of reparations for formerly enslaved? And this one young white man jumped up and he said, I don't want to hear about reparations. My family owned slaves and we were good to our slaves. And he stormed out of the room. There's a defensiveness with people who did something, a defensiveness that says, if I look at myself too closely here, I will see my own need for healing. I will see my own brokenness. So it's easier. So I'm just saying that. And yes, other-centered, it is true. Can't other-center until you know who you are. And you can't look backwards if you aren't willing to go there. Anybody who's ever had therapy knows that the beginning of therapy is to talk about yourself. Not what somebody else did to you. Not what you thought about somebody else thinking about you. But yourself, where you are. And a lot of people can't do that.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. I now open up to your questions, comments, clarifications you would like to have.
Hi, Dr. Mitchem. Thank you very much for that talk. That was quite
Hi.
quite fascinating. Hi, and Andrea White sends her regards, by the way. um, Andrea White's a colleague of ours. Just two quick questions. One is, since you did mention Kamala Harris, and because we are talking about both Black and kind of Jewish perspectives, what potential, if any, do you think the fact that Kamala Harris is married to a Jewish man actually might have, so far as the potential for the relationship between those communities? And then my second quick question is, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the Black Lives Matter movement, mostly for the benefit of those listening, in case they aren't aware of the spiritual aspects of that particular movement, because I think it's also a very good example of what you aptly pointed out, which is the difference between religion and spirituality, because there's a tension within the Black Lives Matter movement, because they're often seen as going against what are seen as more traditional Christian beliefs, but at the same time see themselves as very spiritual and pulling very much on some of the kind of Black church in the United States, as well as African rituals, like the ones you mentioned in New Orleans. So I was wondering if maybe some of the listeners might be interested in the kind of the spiritual aspects of BLM, because we mostly see it maybe as a movement for human rights or as a kind of political group, but not understanding the spiritual aspects of it.
Okay. I think if anyone who wants to just see some of the spiritual aspects, all you have to do is look at their website. And remember, I'm understanding spiritual in this very wide sense. It's not a sense of only grounded in religion. Realize, though, that this also represents a change in Black communities. That change actually started with now President Barack Obama when he was running as a senator. One of the things that happened politically in Black communities is that there was a kind of dominance by Black Christian churches. Black Christian churches had that dominance from the time of segregation because they were the gatekeepers. So if, the owner of the mill needed some workers, he didn't go, and it was usually a he didn't go to the want ads to look for Black workers. He would go to the pastor of the church to get those. Same thing with politicians. When they were running for office, they would go and get the endorsement of various churches through the pastor. So we saw that really vividly with Bill Clinton. What happened with Barack Obama, though, when he was running the first time, is that churches, when the politician comes to the church, it was expected that the politician give certain promises and some kind of tribute to the church. Barack Obama said, I'm not doing that. So they said, well, you can't come to our church. And that's when he started going to college campuses to speak and community organizations. And he bypassed churches. this was a significant shift. The Black Lives Matter movement is the next step, I think, in that same shift. People talk about the growth of the nuns, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. And the belief always was that that wasn't Black people, that Black people were also religious and spiritual. But Black people have been moving away from church-based spirituality, have been embracing varieties of other types of spirituality, African traditional religions. Before, that kind of thing was off to the side. It was a little quirky thing. But now with Black Lives Matter, many of the people who started, who helped to grow that movement were also those who had been kicked out of Black churches or not as welcome. There were a lot of gay people, gay lesbian people as part of that movement. And when that happened and the movement took off, and they didn't, you know, I've read things by them, they didn't expect it to take off the way that it did. Oh, also Black churches were notorious for having a pecking order. Young people didn't come forward to do things. That's also people, you wait your turn, let all these people who are elderly continue to run the church with wisdom. We'll let you have drums every other Sunday. But other than that, you go sit down and be quiet and listen to your elders. These movements are coming through young people, and they're not taking any nonsense from the churches. They're saying it is nonsense to say that my rights have to wait until you agree that they're important. And so that's part of it. You also mentioned Harris, and her husband actually is Jewish. And one of the things, honestly, when I heard that the first time, I kept saying to myself, oh, when is somebody gonna attack her for also having a Jewish husband? Because she's been attacked for her Asianness, her Blackness. She's attacked by some Black people for not being a real Black person, because her father came from Jamaica, so she couldn't be a real Black person. All of this is why I'm so interested in the idea of human rights from below, and the idea that every head is a world, and the idea that it is so complicated, because every time we start working a little bit into these things, we run into these walls that are incredible, just incredible. I talked to a Cuban American guy about the idea that a group called Hispanics, which I contend really doesn't exist, are now the number 2 or the number 1 minority, the most populous minority. I don't know how you do that. The most populous minority in the country. And his response to me was, well, you know why they do that? They do that to keep Black people in their place and to push them to the side. It was a fascinating conversation that I had with him. But yeah, Black Lives Matter, I think, represents a future. We saw some of that with the kids from Parkland. We saw some of that with a lot of these different groups that are now being much less dependent on Black churches, and Black churches know it. And they're trying to figure out what to do.
Right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
When you were talking about spirituality, you said we are not healing. Can we heal? Will we heal?
Do we choose to heal? That the person who said that we are not healing is Amber, but that's how she committed her life to working for social justice. So the lack of healing is something that she committed her life to. I think we can heal. Margaret, I am so optimistic all the time. I'm actually optimistic because of things that young people are doing. They're not sitting around waiting till we solve stuff. They're working. The simple thing, Black Girl Magic. There are all kinds of little Black Girl Magic groups around, some of whom are doing work like we're getting all of these young girls ready to be in pageants. And I'm kind of like, no, that's kind of not where we need to go. But it's just this idea of how do you build up? How do you change definitions that other people have laid on you? And the way to do it is one step, one day at a time. So I'm hopeful. I think we can heal. I think, and through my lifetime, I've seen a lot of healing. When I first went home, now my mother is deceased. When I first went home with an afro many years ago, I had a big afro too. But when I first went home with one, she wouldn't speak to me for 2 years. She was totally offended that I did that to my hair. The next thing I know, she's in a class action lawsuit about women not getting equal pay. I'm like, what happened? How did you get liberated? So it can happen. It might happen a person at a time. But I am also very, very optimistic about young people. What one of the Parkland kids had this saying, I call BS. So a lot of times older people come up with stuff. Young people are saying, I call BS. They're not taking it. So I'm hopeful. I am. We can heal.
Thank you.
Talking about young people, I know we have some students in our audience, our attendees, and I know it because at least 3 of them are in my class. So I wonder whether we can have a comment, a question from one of our NAU students who are attending today.
Oh, they're shy. Just like my students. Okay, wait a minute.
It is, of course, open to anyone else too.
I have to look at my Kindle to tell you, but it's her most recent one.
Are you responding to the chat?
To a chat, yeah, the most recent book by Patrice. And it's something like The Meaning of Power or The Purpose of Power. And so it's really looking at what does it mean? You're gonna make me look this up, aren't you? While another question comes in.
So my name is David, and I'm up in Seattle, and I just thank you for your talk. It's so refreshing to hear your voice and your perspective. I really appreciated your kind of expansive understanding of spirituality and how you named, and I think in your first story, the person who might not have understood or thought about ourselves in a spiritual sense, but really thought about the let's see, what did I write down as, I almost think about this as a longing for wholeness that I think you were naming. And so that counted for a sense of spirituality. And I really appreciated that. I was also drawn to your sense of healing that you've already kind of brought up. And I'm not sure you named it in this way, but I'm just, first of all, I'm kind of wondering what do you think about what are the things that actually that we can do to bring about healing? And then secondly, you, I think, said something similar to this phrase, but this is a phrase that I learned from a womanist theology when I listened to the Fuller Seminary in 2018, did a womanist conference, and it's on YouTube. But this woman named Candace Shields talked about her work as a practical womanist theology in relationship to this whole idea of disenfranchised grief and really listening to people in their unprocessed grief as a way to bring healing into the world. And some of the gestures and ways that you were talking really kind of brought that out for me. And I was just wondering if you could maybe comment and articulate some of that.
Sure. I think our shared stories are critically important, David. I think that that concept that you raised of unprocessed grief, of listening to people in their unprocessed grief. I think if we're the listener, we're really, really listening. Sometimes we need to establish relationships with people so that they will tell us true about what they're hearing. So it's about relationship and mutuality. So it's not, I've known people who are always telling their story, but they're never listening to anybody else. It's the difference between sympathy and compassion. So we don't want to have just somebody like a sympathy ear, like, oh, poor baby, but more of a compassion, like I really hear you and I understand and I'm with you. I had a really hard because it was difficult. A very brilliant young woman I know was in a terrible car accident, and she's having cognitive problems. And just letting her talk that grief out, like I used to be able to do all these things and now I can't even remember what they are. Letting her talk that out and letting her express that. That's one thing. But then there was another time where I was upset about something and I was calling, and it was in the middle of a work project. And I was calling, my leader to say, and the leader said, snap out, not physically hitting me, but just verbally, kind of like, snap out of it, get your head in the game, eyes on the prize. And so I think that is also part of community. What you're talking about is being in community. It's not simply listening, but also making a commitment to and with each other that is long-term. So, to say that we live in a world where all the people we look like us, and all the people we're around have the same kinds of things we do, and then there's something wrong, because we don't live in a world of, plastic stamps of human beings. So there should be diversity in our acquaintances and in what we do. The very fact that you said you took this class and you heard what was said says that there are things planted in you that will grow. So good. You're on mute. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
I wait a second for someone to jump in. If not, I do have a question.
Okay.
Stephanie, I had mentioned in my introduction to you that you wrote a book on womanist theology, and David just mentioned that same term. I suspect that not everyone on our Zoom call has any idea what that means. Could you explain just in a few words or lines or thoughts like what that means and what that is?
So when I started my doctoral studies, I was looking very specifically at African-American women's spirituality, and there was this thing, it was relatively new in 1980 something, called womanist theology. So I said, let me focus there. And the whole point was to bring all these things together. Womanist theology aims for a more holistic view of humans, a more holistic, when I say holistic, it's not just about women, it's about men as well. Trying to think of an example. The term womanist theology actually began with a statement at the front, like a front piece by Alice Walker, where she talks about being a womanist. Womanist stood in contrast to being feminist, but it was very specifically related to spiritual life. And so there have been branches of that have gone into history. It never quite has taken off. History still is dependent on Black feminist theology. Sociology, Black feminist theology. Womanist theology is really something that has grown within church settings. Why? Part of the reason is that Black women as a whole are not interested in being feminists. Why? Because during the growth of the feminist, of suffragette even talking about 100 years of women voting, Black women were excluded. Black women were often set to the side. So while it was 100 years for white women to get the vote, it took longer than that for Black women to get the vote. Black women have not had the vote that long. And it was white women who often decided politically it was to their advantage to get their rights, because if we have all these Black women with us, they won't let us achieve anything. I've very much oversimplified history. So the comment about, looking backward and so I just compressed history in major ways. Womanist theology then took this absent history, took this, and it was only absent in the books. It was real history. Took that history, drew from people like Anna Julia Cooper, drew from people like Sojourner Truth, drew from people like Harriet Tubman, and thought about what it means to be a Black woman in the United States, and used the words of Alice Walker to work with an idea of womanist. And what did it mean to be a womanist? And so that worked in churches. Church communities were very comfortable with Black women saying that they are womanist. And that is the basis. There are Black women bishops like Bishop Vashti McKenzie, who has actually written a book called about the spirituality of womanist thought. Sometimes, not all the time, sometimes I will say that womanist theology is directly related to Black feminist theology. It has the same focus on intersectionality. It has the same focus on concerns for justice for all Black people, for all people. And that was the first book I wrote. I studied that, so it was actually from my dissertation. And the point was that also started me on a path of really doing ethnographic work when I put things together. So throughout that book, I included, so I was teaching undergrads in Detroit at that time. I would have the students read draft chapters for the class and then have them comment and write study questions. Those study questions and some of their comments with their names actually did get included in the book itself. So it started me on a different sense of relationship and relationality about how I write as well. So I'd like to think of what I've written as being more in a womanist frame, in that kind of inclusive, broad, for the good of all people frame. I know that really doesn't explain it well, but
no, you're
said
fine.
in a few words, and as soon as you said in a few words, I went,
It certainly, you know it better clearly than I do, but it certainly was another source of resilience to develop this this kind of theology from a womanist perspective. And you taking it to ethnographic studies, some of you heard me say this just before we started, that Stephanie is going to go to Nigeria and continue ethnographic studies. You want to end with a few sentences about that new adventure that you're just about to embark on next week?
I've been working on it for a few years. And the question is, what are the ways to bridge between Black people in the United States and people on the continent of Africa? No, I won't say quite often. Sometimes I have heard people from the African continent who are quite dismissive of Black Americans. So how do we move out of that kind of distance, I guess is what I want to say. How do we find out how we're connected? I heard a saying, and I've tried to track down this saying, that Africa started with colonization when colonization began, but enslavement began when colonization ended. So it's this sense, it's connected, and I'm trying to figure out how it's connected. This will be the first time I've been to the continent. I've been before where I've been in conferences. This is going to be the first time where we're actually going to have a discussion about those differences. And I have to, I'm supposed to have some talking points in today. Oh, okay.
That will be the task after this Zoom conference. Actually, we actually reached our 75 minutes. We usually try to stay within the time that we all committed to, both our guest speaker and those who are attending. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us. I do wish you the best for the travel next week, that you take off safely, that you arrive safely, that you come back safely.
Thank you.
It was really wonderful to hear you talk, to help us understand many of the issues that all of us are struggling in our own ways, in our own communities, and then to hear from your perspective and your wisdom that you shared with us. Thank you so much for all who attended. Thank you for being with us. I hope you join us again for our remaining sessions in both of our series. If you have any questions, send us an email. We are happy to let you know how to sign up if you don't know yet how to do this or didn't get the information. Again, Stephanie, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Stephanie, Stephanie left already.
She has those talking points to do.
I guess. Hi, Myrna. You're muted, Myrna. We don't hear you. Here
I'm
you are.
sorry I started late.
I know, but you're here.
I'm here, yes, and I'll be here next time for your next speaker. And I wanted to ask you, how do I access your previous speakers?
Some of them, it always takes a little bit of time before we get them downloaded in the shape we need them. But we have 2 of them already in our YouTube channel, and I can see whether I can send it to you.
And
Susie Heschel is not yet there, but we're working on it.
If you look at the first message in the chat, there's an address, a web address where you can go and look at them.
Okay, well, the first message I have is David Hahn, but
Melissa can send it to me and I can forward it to you, Myrna.
oh, thank you. Thank you.
Myrna, Melissa, I don't think you know each other. Melissa is our program coordinator at the Institute. We have offices next to each other. We work very closely together for the past 8 years since I've been here. And without Melissa, we wouldn't have an institute. I'm fairly certain about that.
Thank you, Melissa. I thank you too.
And Myrna is part of our, Melissa, you may have heard that I sometimes go to the UK every 2 years with a group of 35 Holocaust genocide scholars. Myrna is part of this group until recently, and very much involved into the understanding of the Holocaust from a feminist perspective and focusing on women in the Holocaust.
Thank
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, that's still my thing. Also, Alice Walker, when she introduced the womanist theology, I was doing my early work at that time, and I was working on Zora Neale Hurston, and so was Alice Walker. So we did intersect, yeah. And
Yeah.
she was at the same conference I was where we celebrated Hurston. Very good, yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us. And I hope you can join us for Susan Naiman or other speakers in the future.
You know that I'll be there if I at all can. And I
Great.
keep up with what you're doing. Thank you both.
Thanks, Myrna.
Thank you.
Good night.
All right. Melissa, I talk to you later.
Okay, I'm ending the meeting.
We can end the meeting now.
Okay.